Hello and welcome back to 10 with Zen, where we talk about all things education, leadership and much more. Presented today by your host, Helen Woodward. Today I'm very excited. We've got two guests on 10 with Zen. We've got Dr. Conkbayir and Rachel Buckler. Now, Minay, I've seen your work developing on LinkedIn through your posts, and that's been really great to see. So welcome to 10 with Zen.
Thank you for inviting me on, Helen.
You're very welcome. Minay, you're an author. You're a doctor of philosophy, specialising in neuroscience. You're an award-winning lecturer, trainer and researcher, and you've worked in early childhood education and care for over 20 years now. And I know you're passionate about bridging the knowledge gap between neuroscience and early years. So we're really excited to talk with you today. And Rachel, now you and I go back many years. In fact, we both did our NNEBs in the same year. I'm not going to say when that was on this podcast.
Very long time ago.
It was a long time ago. We've been friends for many years with a shared interest and background in early years. And you're an experienced early years practitioner, trainer, author and consultant. Welcome to 10 with Zen.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so today we're here to talk about neuroscience and early years. And Minay, I'm going to start off by asking you, many of us in the past were trained in behaviour management, okay? But how is your research into neuroscience now challenging some of those old ideas?
Well, Helen, it's not my research per se, but I like to think that I'm a conduit between what goes on in the labs and what we can use in our earlier settings. And to put it very simply, the brain is where our genes and the environment meet. We all know that. It's where nature and nurture interact. That's the stuff that we see. And our social environments can affect our brain circuitry and biochemistry, which are also influenced by genetic controls. Genes are either switched on or off, depending on our early caregiving experiences, for example. And these neurobiological mechanisms can then, in turn, affect behaviour. So although, for example, we now have access to behavioural neuroscience, which explores the impact of the brain on behaviour, we also have a window into the impact of neurobiological differences, or SEND, and exposure to adverse childhood experiences on the brain, and then in turn how these shape early brain development and function. So serious child abuse like sexual, physical and emotional abuse, neglect and institutionalization are very closely linked to anxiety and depression and other mental health issues, not only in childhood but in later life. And studies on the brain repeatedly show us that children who have experienced severe abuse have, for example, smaller prefrontal cortexes, which are critical for all the learning stuff, all the school readiness stuff, a term I hate, but also the amygdala, which is the panic button of the brain, if you like. And these play a key role in emotion regulation and the emergence of anxiety and depression. And there's a quote by Dr. Dan Siegel that I love to use when we're discussing the many perils of using damaging tactics like putting a child in timeout and isolation booths to manage behaviour. And he says that when a response is to isolate a child, an instinctual psychological need of the child goes unmet. And brain imaging shows that the experience of that relational pain, like that caused by rejection, looks very similar to the experience of physical pain in terms of brain activity on those brain scans. I mean, what more evidence do we need to step away from such behaviour management approaches?
So what's really jumping out to me here is this doesn't only apply to early years. This applies right through your whole school years, through your adult years as well.
It scars psychologically as well as physically in some cases, 100%, absolutely.
Okay, and I'm really appreciating the distinct and succinctness with which you're explaining this, because I know you're so knowledgeable about this, and these are big concepts, but really appreciating the way you're getting it into kind of bite-sized chunks, which are very manageable. So Minay, tell us about self-regulation and why this is so important.
Self-regulation at its simplest is how we manage our emotions and the consequent behaviours arising from those emotions. So let's take a typical one, feeling angry. or what is it to feel angry? How does it manifest in my body? And what does it usually make me do? Does it make me hit my hands on the table? Yes, which I did yesterday when my laptop smashed. Whatever it is, but it's about that self-awareness of our emotions and how they make us behave in the heat of the moment. Most importantly, it's how we manage to overcome those emotions and behaviors or not, depending on how we have had our emotions co-regulated by our caregivers, be they our foster carers, primary caregivers, parents. So we are not born with the equipment to self-regulate. And this is going to send me off on another tangent, but very briefly, this is why we must not. There should be a law against leaving babies to cry out for hours and hours and shutting them in a dark room, because they don't stop because, oh, that's it. They've learned their lesson. What they're doing is switching off because they've realized those caregivers will not be there for them when they need it. But their dysregulated nervous systems continue. But that pain is in silence alone. Gone unchecked, this can become the withdrawn child. They can develop a pseudo self-reliance, which means I'm all right, I don't need anyone, I can take care of myself, which is very common actually in children who have been abused, for example. So why is self-regging so important? It's actually a matter of life or death. So let me unpack that. Where we can't self-regulate, we start to engage in behaviours that are maladaptive, which are bad for us. And while they might feel good in the moment, they are definitely detrimental to our holistic health and well-being in the long term. So it might be a child self-harming, all right, but young children don't self-harm. Well, of course they do. They might be pulling out their hair, pinching their skin, kicking something, kicking doors, hurting somebody else, anything to have an outlet for that distress. Why? Because they haven't been shown how to self-regulate through co-regulation. And that could be simple things like slowing down, stepping away, taking some slow, deep breaths. It might be doing some guided imagery, picture something you like, picture your favorite place to go. Let's go for a walk outside. Walking in nature is fantastic. All these things, grounding techniques, immediately soothe our nervous systems. But my point I want to make about why it's so important is the signs of self-harm in teenagers, for example. Studies repeatedly show that the self-harming behaviours were there 10 years before in childhood, very early childhood. And that's showing us that these children were not co-regulated by their primary caregivers. And I was actually called to save someone's life a few months ago, back in the summer. I went to my local shop. Manager looked really down. I was like, what's going on? She's like, my staff member, she doesn't want to come. She wants to kill herself. I don't know what to do. Please speak to her. I said, I don't know. What am I going to say? So I tapped on the car window. I said, look, is it all right to have a chat? I'm brilliant at annoying people. And I just thought I might, annoy you for a few minutes, if that's all right. You could tell me to F off. I don't mind. And she opened the car door. She was in a right state, bless her. We spoke for nearly 3 hours. You've got childhood trauma going on. You've got dyslexia. You've got ADHD. You've got no family network. All of these things. And I said to her, have you noticed something? I said, I've made you laugh. I said, you've calmed right down. Your breathing's changed. You're not crying anymore. And you're talking about things you actually want to do and that you want to achieve. I said, that's you self-regging right here. Yeah, but it's only because you listened. I said, well, that's great. I said, but it shows me that you do have hope and you can self-regulate. So, that's just one tiny example of the importance of self-regulation. It really can be the matter of life and death. Also, it underpins everything we do, right? If we can't self-regulate, the three of us here, we wouldn't have managed to sit down. We wouldn't have managed to hold a conversation. All right, fair enough. It's all one way at the minute, but, we're listening to one another. We're going to take turns. We can reel in our, impulsive behaviours, all of that stuff. And research is telling us time and time again also that a child's ability to self-regulate at 3-4 is a better indicator of academic success than those numeracy and literacy skills, etc. Self-regulation really provides the underpinning qualities needed in order to then go on and develop those skills that we need to get on in society. It is fundamentally essential.
I mean, Minnie, that's really helpful. You've absolutely laid it on the line for us about how essential self-regulation is. And it really is the difference between life and death. And it's also the difference between what enables you to function just in everyday life and relationships. So, Rachel, I'm going to put this one over to you because I know you work extensively with early years providers across the country. Are you seeing an understanding of how practice needs to change and an embracing of ideas like neuroscience and self-regulation and a move away from the old behaviour management?
I'd say yes, I am. Mineo and I have worked quite closely together now. And in fact, I was thinking about it earlier. I think it's about 6 years. A colleague introduced me to Mineo and I was really intrigued and inspired by her work. And it got me thinking, first of all, let me just note that it got me thinking about how I wish I had had that knowledge when I was a practitioner.
Absolutely.
And Helen, most of my career has been working in child protection, safeguarding context with social care, early years, children's centres and so on and so on. And I regularly think about families and children, particularly children I work with, where it was really hard to understand their behaviours in regard to trauma they would have experienced. And actually, when I think now, and I can see, I can remember staff that I was working with and that I'd managed settings for quite some time and trying to bring calm to a child that was distressed and actually, doing a really good job at that. But if they'd have had the knowledge around co-regulation, how much better would that have been, and also the knowledge of brain architecture and what healthy brain development involves. I will say also that I think generally the sector has and is beginning to embrace the whole concept of neuroscience and brain development. And I think for some, they have reached out to find out more. They have looked, and Minnie works very closely, as I do, with some people in the sector, where they've changed their policies and procedures, where they've not just decided they're going to take a different approach, but actually they've completely tipped the whole thing upside down and started from the point of understanding neuroscience and then creating a culture which not only embraces the learning around neuroscience and brain development, but actually uses it to inform better ways of practice. So 100% there is a change. That said, I had a conversation with a colleague just last week. She works a lot with neurodivergent children, for instance, and she was saying that she's going into settings to support, and there's still a lack of understanding about how to really support children who don't just need strategies around how we might manage behavior or strategies about how we can engage children in certain ways, but it's more about it's more about an understanding. So I think it's a mixed bag. That said, I'm really encouraged by some of the practice I do see. And I was in a setting the other day. I saw a beautiful thing where a manager of a setting who had embraced very much so started to learn about neuroscience and really understanding about self-regulation, co-regulation. And a little boy in the room in the nursery had started to get quite distressed about something. He was frustrated. He couldn't quite do something, or he couldn't do something he was trying to do, or so on. And this practitioner came alongside and just calmly said to him, "I think you're finding it difficult to do so and so, aren't you?" And straight away he switched from a sigh of relief, and then he said, "Yes, I am." And then together, it was wonderful. She then said, "Well, let's figure it out together, shall we?" And he changed in an instant, rather than, continue to be frustrated and anxious and distressed because he couldn't do what he was trying to do. And I just think that that demonstrates a switch or a change in people's learning around this. So it's very positive, I think.
So, and that's a lovely example that you've given. And it's those really small moments, isn't it? Those kind of micro interactions, if you like, that make such a big difference to the lives of children and young people, and to all of us, actually. So Rachel, supposing I'm a nursery leader and I've been reading the research and I've, got Mine's books and I'm really excited and fired up and going, wow, this is amazing. What would your advice be about how I go about implementing this learning, bringing everybody on board and making sure that in those micro interaction moments, we're actually developing a culture of that kind of practice in the nursery?
Right. Okay. Well, I suppose ultimately, Mine's done lots of training, and she's got one particular training course which is available, which is neuroscience in the early years, and I'll kind of plug that now. It's been produced by Hallmark Education, and that's available for anyone. It's free. Feel free to jump in, Mine, if you want to talk about this, but it is an exceptional course. The reviews have been fantastic. It's not just a quick go through the course. It's a proper, understanding the concepts and understanding neuroscience and self-regulation, and then applying some learning and, an extent of kind of self-directed learning to achieve the certificate at the end, but so that people can definitely do that. But I would say that whilst, obviously the impact that leaders can have in early years practice, not just on their own learning, has to start there, I guess, and then thinking about how they can implement some strategies and bring the team along with them, because that's the key, isn't it? And being able to identify what in our setting can we achieve. And I am going to ask Mine here, because there are settings that have done that, haven't they, Mine? And you'll know, because you still work with them very much so, and it has completely changed the way they work and operate.
Completely transformed. I'm thinking of one large nursery chain with, I think, how many nurseries now? 40?
Oh, more than that. Yeah, about 50 odd nurseries in the country.
Yeah, and their head of early years engaged with actually both of my online trainings, neuroscience in early years and then self-reg in early years. And she was so not impressed by it, but the messages, underpinned by the neuroscience of self-regulation, that she said, a light bulb went off, and it was like, oh my goodness, we cannot continue the way we are. So they transformed all of their documentation and approaches towards behavior, and rename them, use different practices, so being more curious about children's behavior, as opposed to seeing something that doesn't quite fit the norm and the healthy and going, right, wallop, in we go with the behavior plan, speak to the parents, and then the parents feel awful, the child feels even worse, then you're just caught up in this cycle. So they made everything more about self-regulation, getting the parents and families involved and the staff in understanding self-reg and their role as co-regulators, and looking at behaviour more as something to be understood and nurtured, as opposed to being controlled. And the head of early years consistently reports now that referrals for SEND have halved, that the children are calmer, the staff are calmer, improved relationships between children and their families at home, and actually an acknowledgement among many family members that really their mental health needs a bit more of a focus and a bit more help. So it's just been, beneficial for everybody concerned, to be honest. And there's just a calmer learning environment in that nursery as well, because if we are feeling safe, soothed, seen, secure, our panic button, our amygdala is offline, and our prefrontal cortex is online, so we can sit down and we can learn and we can be pro-social and we can have fun. And that's what's happening in those nurseries, and it's just joyous.
I think also what you said about what can support the implementation of that, and Mine's just picked up on that, it's working with parents around that, so that consistent messages are applied not only in the setting but also in the home, and that also parents understand that this is how we're going to approach this, and we want you to be able to do it with us, and let's learn together how we can best meet the needs for your child, which of course we know each child will be different and unique. So that's important too, working with parents and making that a whole consistent approach.
Yeah, got to be the golden thread.
Oh, nice. Yeah. And I'm picking up on two things that have really jumped out at me listening to you. One is safe, soothed, seen and secure. Really, really
That's
great.
Dr. Dan Siegel. That's not mine. That's Dr. Dan Siegel. Okay, I love his work. But yeah.
Dr. Dan Siegel. Okay. And the other thing was that lovely phrase by the nursery leader who said, "We cannot continue as we are." And I thought how powerful a statement that is when you've been through a learning process, experienced yourself. And that demonstrates that the meaning has been made, doesn't it? It's, somebody hasn't just kind of read the material, they've made meaning of it, and they're going, we have to change. We have to change. And that's such evidence of learning when we go, we have to change. Okay, you've kind of been segueing us nicely into the question I've got here about how can adults develop their own self-regulation? Because this is sounding to me like an essential component here.
Yeah, without it, we cannot co-regulate, and that means our children won't be able to self-regulate. So, we're social animals. We are wired for connection. We need others, but we need to be in a good position ourselves in order to be emotionally available to those that need it. It might not be a child, it might be a spouse, it might be a family member or a friend. So the number one thing, the first step, is to be aware of our own thoughts, feelings, and behavior. That's the foundation for self-regulation. And without it, there is no ability to reflect or choose a different path. We just carry on, troubleshooting, going and rumbling from one day to the next, not realizing why we keep making the same mistakes, why we keep attracting negative people, for example. It's like, whoa, man, maybe I need to just check out what I'm doing, why I'm reacting the way I am all the time. And there are a few simple things we can do. I think I mentioned earlier on. So it might be getting a notepad, writing down our triggers, identifying them, and then, thinking, right, well, how can I reduce these triggers? It might be practicing daily mindfulness, which is a brilliant way to improve, yes, self-regulation and general well-being. But what it also does over time and consistent practice is that it strengthens the prefrontal cortex, because you're there having to focus on nothing. And those of us that are ADHDers, myself included, it's bloody difficult to sit down and not think of anything and not do anything. So you're strengthening that essential brain region while quietening that panic button, the amygdala. It's offline. All is good. All is safe. So mindfulness is excellent. It's a great way to still the mind, stops it buzzing for a while. Grounding techniques like the 3-2-1, 3 things you can see, 2 you can smell, 1 you can touch. Might be square breathing. So in for 4, pause for 4, out for 4, on you go, or 5 and 5. There's loads of variations. There's what else can we do? Journaling. It's going to be different strokes for different folks, but they're just some popular ways that we can self-regulate. Taking yourself out into nature, I find, is immediately grounding. But that deep breathing, although it sounds simple, it's the quickest and only way that we can control our autonomic nervous system. It's the only thing we can control. So once we've got our breathing slowed down, a panic, quick heart rate is slowed down. And that sends the message to the brain that, wow, there's no lion coming to attack me. I'm okay.
Yeah.
And then your rational brain is back online. So, yeah.
Yeah. Minnie, you've given us lots of ideas there, lots of things to think about, and some really practical steps that we can all take. And what's jumping out to me is that this is a practice. It's not something that you do once. It's something that we do every day. Rachel, you've talked with us about the training, which is really helpful. And Minnie, I know that you've got some books that people can buy. So we'll definitely make sure that we spend some time just talking briefly about your books. Do you want to tell us about your books?
So talk about your latest book.
Just tell us the title. And look, there's a picture of it even.
Yeah,
a picture of Minnie even.
No, don't look at me. There's my book. Can you see my book only?
Okay, so your book is called The Neuroscience of the Developing Child, Self-Regulation for Wellbeing.
Why I'm proud of that book is because I managed to get an interview with Dr. Stuart Shanker, who, in my humble opinion, is the global voice of self-regulation theory. There are many, but a lot of them veer towards cognitive explanations, but his is practical, focused on, should I say it's focused on emotion regulation? It's just fantastic. So there's an interview with him, and then the foreword is written by his partner at Self-Reg Global, Dr. Susan Hopkins. So 2 globally credible voices, absolutely fantastic way to start that book. And it's 6 chapters. The first 2 are very detailed about what self-reg is, why it's important, the role of co-regulation, what that looks like. And there are a lot of case studies by that nursery that we've just been talking about, because their practice has just been so transformative. We've got their policies in there, lots of questions for reflection to put into practice. And then the last chapter, chapter 6, is all about sustainability and looking at our responsibilities as individuals, but as, as a collective as well, and how love and respect for others cannot really hope to thrive if we have not got that self-respect and that self-love. And how the origins of that, come from pretty much preconception in utero, doesn't it? So it's all about all our relationships with one another and our relationship to the earth, essentially.
That sounds great. And thank you so much for just telling us about that book that you've most recently written. We're very excited to be sharing those with our nursery practitioners who work with us at Zen and beyond. So both of you, what an amazing impact you're having through your work on the lives of children and young people through the staff that you're working with and the work you're doing. So thank you so much for that, because we know it makes a massive impact on the lives of children every day when they have good experiences with the people who care for them. Thank you for joining us on 10 with Zen. You've been brilliant guests today. And thank you everyone for listening to 10 with Zen.
10 with Zen is brought to you by Zen Educate. Zen Educate's online platform puts you in control of supply and recruitment. To receive 50% off your first day booked with Zen, just DM us on Twitter @Zen Educate and quote 10 with Zen. Thanks for listening.